Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in criminal law. We're going to continue to talk about various different homicide offences in this lesson, focusing on the idea of gross negligence manslaughter. So we've been spending some time over the last few lessons talking about the different kinds of manslaughter being mainly described as voluntary manslaughter. So, for example, we looked in the previous lessons at the concept of voluntary manslaughter by way of diminished responsibility. And then we also looked at voluntary manslaughter through the concept of the loss of control. We then start to talk about involuntary manslaughter and described one known as constructive manslaughter or unlawful act manslaughter, where you essentially have an already existing offence that is committed, but that is the offence that you use to construct a further offence, i.e., the offence of manslaughter on top of, essentially. This lesson is going to talk about the final of the main manslaughter offences. We're going to focus on the concept of manslaughter by way of gross negligence. Gross negligence manslaughter is a kind of voluntary manslaughter, or an involuntary manslaughter, should I say, which pertains specifically to the negligence of an act or an omission. And with that in mind, you should be able to essentially make some comparisons, at least in terms of the components of negligence, from your studies in the law of tort. So those of you who have studied tort at the same time as studying crime, which is most people, or have studied tort previously to studying crime, will know that one of the major elements of the law of tort is the tort of negligence, and some of the components in negligence in that particular area of the law is quite similar to the area of the law where we talk about gross negligence manslaughter. What it does and what it requires for somebody to be shown to have committed gross negligence manslaughter is firstly for a homicide to take place, so there has to be the death of a victim, and for this death to be attributable to the conduct of the defendant. The defendant must have a duty of care towards that victim, in essentially keeping that victim alive. Again, making some comparisons between this and the law of tort, the concept of negligence within the law of tort. And in addition to that, assuming that you can establish a duty of care, that duty must have been breached in relation to the defendant's acts or the defendant's omissions. Now, the key leading case for gross negligence manslaughter, at least when we talk about the jurisdiction of England and Wales, is the case of Adamako from 1995. Now, the facts of this case are relatively simple to understand. The defendant in this case, the individual who was charged with gross negligence manslaughter, was an anaesthetist who had made a mistake in accordance with an operation and in the process of the operation taking place. The operation itself was actually a very straightforward eye operation, and so there was a very little risk of death to the patient in an ordinary sense of the operation itself. It wasn't like an incredibly complicated, evasive operation. It was relatively straightforward, a relatively easy operation to deal with. Now, the breathing machine that the patient was using to breathe while they were essentially under anesthetic had become detached from the patient, so it was no longer operating correctly and no longer actually feeding the patient with oxygen. The anaesthetist should have noticed this mistake. It should have been relatively obvious to an individual who had such a duty of care, who was trained as an anaesthetist, to be able to notice that the breathing machine, the breathing apparatus, had become detached from the patient. Even though this should have been relatively menial and simple to mistake, it took them a whole 9 minutes to do so. And so as a result of which the patient would die in on the operation table. And it was made very clear by the court that where there exists a duty of care, like in the case of the anaesthetist who has an established duty of care towards the patient, okay, criminal liability can arise from a breach of that duty either by an act or an omission. In this case, it was a failure to act in a way that would have been within and accordance with the basic standard of care for an individual of this particular caliber, essentially. So, when we talk about negligence in the context of the criminal law, We are talking about it with some similarities to that of the law of tort. So there is this existence of a duty of care, and there is this breach of a duty of care, which is really the general gold standard, if you will, for what constitutes a negligence case. But when we talk about it in relation to criminal liability, it is an issue that requires more than a just mere trivial amount of negligence. Hence, we don't call this negligence manslaughter. It is called gross negligence manslaughter. This is something that was established in the case of Andrews versus the Director of Public Prosecutions from 1937. In addition to this, since the case of Bateman from 1925, the question of whether or not negligence existed such that it merits a charge of gross negligence manslaughter, so whether or not the level of negligence rises and meets the level of criminal liability for the purposes of manslaughter cases, is actually a question for the jury. It's a question of fact. It's an evidential standard that is going to have to be answered by a jury. And this places quite a lot of responsibility on that of the jury in gross negligence cases, because essentially the jury is able to decide the extent of criminal liability in any given situation. Now, one of the questions that you may want to ask in relation to the criminal law is whether or not this is an acceptable metric, and does this not risk a situation where we create an uncertainty in the law for cases of gross negligence manslaughter and lead to certain circumstances where there are potentially rule of law violations or potentially breaches within the general concept of legal certainty, which is established by basic understanding of the rule of law. If it is up to a jury to decide the extent of criminal liability, then an individual jury on any different case may come up with a number of different answers depending on the metrics that they are examining. So a different jury, for example, on a different day, when given the evidence as to the extent to which the kind of negligence crosses over the threshold to meet gross negligence manslaughter standards, is something of a subjective decision, because a different jury might come to a different conclusion. This is one of the problems that you may come and be faced with when it comes to the concept of gross negligence manslaughter. The law is now made a few slight changes to this issue, and so it represents something of an encroachment on the role of the jury in these cases. So the question for the jury now pertains to whether there is gross negligence once it has been concluded that the negligent act or omission was the cause of the death. This is relatively more satisfying, if you will, because essentially what this is doing is it is essentially laying a bit more of a groundwork before the jury has asked the question and is asked to consider the question as to whether or not the kind of action or omission can rise to the standard of being gross negligence. So essentially, before the issue of whether or not gross negligence has existed, that is only pertained after it has been shown that the negligent action or the negligent omission was the cause of death itself. And then we can come to the conclusion that, okay, that this was the cause of death itself, that it was negligence that caused this individual's death, but does this negligence simply give rise to criminal liability in the case of tort? Or could it give rise to criminal liability if it meets such a standard as to essentially cross into gross negligence? Now, a case that we looked at in previous lessons when we talked about omissions is the case of Crown versus Broughton. Now, this is from 2020, so it's a relatively recent case, and it's a relatively high-profile case as well. And this talks about the concept of gross negligence. And you can see by looking at the facts of this case really what the standard of gross negligence looks like. So in this case, Mr. Broughton, the defendant, was a rapper who had supplied his girlfriend with some Class A drugs while they were both at a music festival. Now, in addition to the supplying of the Class A drugs, the defendant had claimed to have altered the drugs to potentially increase their effects. Now, the medical evidence and or the testimony didn't actually give any specific details as to what the things that the defendant did to the drugs to actually alter them, but there was just the claim that the drugs had been altered. the question of whether or not they had been altered was essentially something more of a just a contextual question, more so than actually giving rise to criminal liability, given the fact that liability in this case arises out of an omission more so than the act. The victim the victim being the girlfriend of the defendant, then began to take an adverse reaction to the drugs. Now, the reason why the issue of whether or not the drugs was altered could have been important because it might have given rise to this adverse reaction to the drugs, but we don't know. People who are supplied ordinary drugs can also have adverse reactions to them. People can have menial reactions to any kind of substance in reality. Now, when they began to take the drugs and have an adverse reaction to them, the defendant didn't actually alert the relevant authorities or even call for help. So it was very clear that the victim was in distress and the victim was potentially in a position where they were going to die, but the defendant didn't do anything about it. Instead, what he did was film the victim and then spoke to her parents about what was happening. Quite a troublesome situation. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting here, and really where liability arises for this case, because we're talking about an omission in this case, because he failed to act in a particular way to call for help, was that according to expert medical testimony in the trial, it suggested that if the defendant had gotten the victim seen to at an earlier point, there was a specific time at which the medical expert suggested, there may have been upwards of a 90% chance that the victim would have survived. So it wasn't like they took an adverse reaction to the drugs, and it was at that point at which the victim was essentially her fate was sealed, because it could have been the case that the defendant could have called for help, and that would have led to a potentially 90% chance that the victim would have survived, according to medical testimony. And so given all of these facts, you can clearly understand why the courts come to the conclusion and why the defendant was convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. And this was gross negligence in the case of the omission. He had failed to act in the circumstances in a way that would have been reasonable. Okay, the standard in this case related to whether or not the danger was immediately apparent, striking, and glaring. So this is quite a higher standard than that of ordinary negligence cases for the law of tort, for example, but it makes sense because we're talking about gross negligence. So it's quite a high standard of negligence. You have to have acted particularly negligently to the extent to which the danger was, quote, immediately apparent, striking, and glaring. And that's sort of the general standard that you can see when we talk about gross negligence manslaughter cases. In this video, what I want to do is carry on talking about gross negligence manslaughter, talking about the concept of a duty of care in relation to gross negligence manslaughter. Now, this is something that we brought up briefly in the previous lesson, but we spent most of our time talking more about the concept of the standard of care, or the standard which is required for there to be more than just a breach and constitute negligence, but also for there to be a breach that constitutes gross negligence, to meet the standard of criminal liability, which we remember was a question for the jury for the most part in these cases. Now, this lesson is going to continue to talk about this type of manslaughter in more detail, examining the nature of the duty of care, and in relation to that, examining the nature of the breach of the duty of care when we talk about the establishment of a gross negligence manslaughter claim. Now, for those of you who have studied negligence, when we do the law of tort, for example, we have a lot of lessons on that already, you'll be somewhat familiar with the concept of the duty of care and the breach of a duty of care. Now, given the fact that you should have studied tort before or during studying criminal law at the same time. I can't think of many law schools that would teach you crime before tort. And given the fact that you learn about negligence first, you should know already what the duty of care is from a basic standpoint within the law of tort and what it means to breach their duty. Now, the general rule when it comes to civil liability is that if there is civil liability, the basis for criminal liability could also be determined too. So, For example, if you can show a duty of care and a breach of duty of care in relation to civil liability, then this could form the basis of criminal liability, depending on two factors. Of course, the extent of the breach, i.e. the extent of the negligence, to what extent does it become gross negligence, and two, whether or not the action, the negligence itself, caused the death of another individual. Because remember, this is a manslaughter case, it's a homicide offence, it requires somebody to die, unfortunately. The defendant's breach of duty must also be a single negligent act. The case of Adamaco, which we looked at in the previous lesson, the case which, if you remember, was the case of the anaesthetist who had failed in their duty to see whether or not a piece of breathing apparatus had become detached from a patient for up to 9 minutes. This, of course, led to this individual dying in a routine eye operation, and so the anaesthetist was found to have been negligent, and that this negligence had crossed into the threshold of gross negligence. But the case of Adamaco also establishes that the breach of a duty of care can take place for an omission. So we talked about a couple of cases in the previous lesson. Adamaco was one, and the case of Crown versus Broughton was the other, both of which involve the liability for omissions. Adamaco was the failure to act to essentially fix the breathing apparatus so the patient can breathe, and the case of Crown versus Broughton was a case where the defendant had failed to call the relevant authorities when his girlfriend had a reaction to some drugs he supplied her with, which caused her to die. So both of which are omissions cases. The case of Crown versus Zaman from 2017 is also one which is of particular interest here. The defendant in this case was the owner of a restaurant. They had consistently and systematically been ignoring the rules and warnings which relate to the correct labelling of their takeaway containers. Specifically in this case, or at least the problem that was at issue, was whether or not the contents of that food contained any nuts or could have contained nuts. These warning labels you will find on every package and every, hopefully every box that you ever order or buy from a shop. It's of course to help limit liability for those who may have an allergic reaction to an item because essentially they have been pre-warned of the fact that this item contains nuts or could contain nuts, and so as a result of which essentially use your own discretion if you are somebody who is allergic to nuts. The defendant in this case, the owner of this restaurant, the restaurant in its entirety, had consistently and systematically been ignoring these rules, and they had been given warnings as well about this particular practice, and had been ignoring those warnings too. And so when one of their customers, the victim, who was allergic to nuts, severely allergic to nuts, to the point where it can cause the death of this individual, consumed takeaway food from this establishment, which contained nuts, even though there were no labels suggesting that the package could have contained nuts or did contain nuts. There was no indication whatsoever. The victim had, as you would imagine, an allergic reaction to the food and died as a result. The courts held that the defendant was to be convicted of gross negligence manslaughter, or at least the jury held that they were to be convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. And you can understand why here as well. This is another example of an omission for basically the failure to act in a particular way. They failed to act in a way which essentially properly advised their customers as to which items did and did not contain nuts, or there was a possibility that they could or could not have contained nuts. They systemically and consistently ignored these rules and warnings, and the result of which led to the death of an individual. So, when it comes to determining the breach of a duty of care, there are a number of different ways in which we can establish and measure the burdens. So we know already, when we looked at early cases and early videos when we looked at criminal law, that the judge will have a legal burden when it comes to trial cases. And then at trial, a jury will have an evidential burden. So the jury will be questioning and will be making determinations on the basis of the facts that are presented. The judge makes determinations on the basis of the law which is presented, essentially. We'll get to this in more detail when we do lessons on both the criminal justice system, but also when we do a number of lessons on criminal evidence in the future at some point this year. Now, when it comes to cases of gross negligence manslaughter, we remember from the previous lesson that the job of the judge is to essentially direct the jury about what the duty of care is in a particular circumstance. So a judge will determine and will communicate this determination to the jury as to where the duty of care lies. And then it is up to the jury to determine whether or not this was breached, whether or not there was a breach. And remember, the breach has to be higher than just a mere negligence standard. It has to be gross negligence. In 2010, we see an example and illustration of this from the case of Crown versus Winter. In this case, we see the explosion in a firework factory. This explosion had killed a fireman and a documentary filmmaker. Now, the issue for this case was whether or not the factory owner owed a duty of care to these individuals who had been killed in the explosion. Now, it was held that the courts made the determination that one is able to utilize the civil rules in the law of tort when making determinations pertaining to the duty of care for gross negligence manslaughter cases when it comes to criminal liability for these actions. And so when it comes to the duty of care in gross negligence manslaughter cases, it is the civil procedure in the law of tort which bears a lot of similarities. But it should also be noted that they're not always the case. Okay, so if you are given a problem question in criminal law and it relates to gross negligence manslaughter, you should be acutely aware of the fact that there are similarities that you can draw between the criminal law and the civil law, the law of tort, in these particular cases when talking about a duty of care and a breach of duty. And so you may and you should be familiar with those particular issues. But you should also be reticent to the fact that you can't just simply apply the law of tort to these cases because we're talking about a completely different jurisdiction. The final thing I want to talk about, therefore, is the case of Crown versus Wacker from 2003. This was a case which involved a lorry driver who had been carrying human cargo, specifically the smuggling of illegal immigrants into the country, illegal migrants. This was a practice that continues, I believe, even to this day, but has been continuing for many, many, many years. There's lots of very, very strong checks at borders in the UK, in places like Dover, for example, but there are still sometimes cases where these things kind of will happen, and often the illegal migrants that travel through in this particular fashion have a real hard time, given the fact that the conditions in these lorries are often very, very, very harsh. In some cases, they aren't oxygenated, and so it causes a number of people to suffocate. And in other cases, they are particularly cold. They may be refrigerated, and it causes people to freeze and ultimately die of exposure. And so there are often cases where there are lorries of people who have been killed or who have died in the process of this quite arduous journey. Now, as you can imagine, it is unlawful for a lorry driver to do this, and so that is a problem in and of itself. But when the driver was coming up to a checkpoint where these smuggled migrants could have been discovered, he closed an air vent, and this air vent was essentially to stop them from being heard. But he had the full intention, of course, to reopen said air vent once he had passed this checkpoint and he was cleared of any kind of wrongdoing. But then, after he passed the checkpoint, he had forgotten to reopen the air vent once he had passed this checkpoint, and the people in the lorry would subsequently die from suffocation because they didn't have any oxygen. And now the argument here was that the defense tried to make the argument that of something known as the ex turpi causa rule. Now, this rule essentially states that a claimant would be unable to pursue legal relief if it arises from their own tortious activities. Okay, so what this essentially means is the action itself was unlawful. The action of smuggling migrants into a country is unlawful. And if we were talking about the law of tort, if we were doing a civil claim, you would have an example where if an individual has been wronged in a way where you may be able to have some kind of tortious action, but you are committing a tortious action yourself and it arises out of your own tortious action, then the ex turpi causa rule tells us that you can't pursue legal relief because someone was tortious towards you because of your own tortious activity. And the defense tried to raise this argument in relation to the illegal immigrants. Now, it was held and rejected by the Court of Appeal, as you can imagine, because they stated that even though it may have credibility in the civil law, it does not have that kind of credibility in the criminal law. So this is just an example of where there are similarities between the two areas of law, between the civil and the criminal law, but also where there are differences between the civil and the criminal law. You should be very, very reticent to the fact that just because you have gross negligence cases and you have phrases like the duty of care and breaches of duty and standards of care and all this kinds of stuff does not mean that you can just essentially copy and paste the civil law into the criminal law jurisdiction. In this final lesson on not only manslaughter, gross negligence manslaughter, and homicide offences generally, we're going to just talk a little bit more and illustrate with a couple more cases the determination of gross negligence for these cases. So we've made it clear over the last few lessons that the determination of gross negligence goes slightly further than that of an ordinary negligence claim that you may find in, for example, the law of tort. And so, really, we're going to talk a little bit more about how gross negligence is determined in these particular cases. And the first thing that we have to always reference when we think about how gross negligence is determined, the standard of threshold that is required, is that of the role that is played by the jury in these cases. Because while it is the case that there has to be the establishment that the negligence in question was the cause of death for the victim, it is up to the jury to determine whether or not this negligence, which did cause the death of the victim, rose to the level of gross negligence, rose to the level of being passable, for example, for essentially criminal liability. And so it was determined in the case of Adamako that once a duty of care is established, the ordinary ways in which we establish duty of care in relation to the acts or omissions of the defendant, it is up to the jury to consider whether or not there is a breach of duty. The jury will then determine whether or not that breach in question should be characterized as gross negligence. So the jury has quite a significant role in both of these different instances. Not only do they have the role of determining whether or not there was a breach, but then also determining whether or not this breach was so severe and so sufficient that it represented gross negligence and therefore enters into the realm of being of criminal liability. Now, in recent years and in recent cases, there have been issues in limiting the extent to which the jury can go beyond this duty. And given the fact that the jury have so much authority in making determinations as to gross negligence in these different cases, they have a determination on the basis of where breach exists, and they have a determination on the basis of what characterizes gross negligence. There is this question of how far the jury can go and the extent to which the court should be able to limit the power and the extent to which the jury can go beyond the duty that they have established. Now, a case that is quite illustrative of this point comes from 2016, which is the Crown versus Sellu case in the Court of Appeal. In this case, an individual had entered into a hospital to undergo knee replacement surgery. So this was a medical malpractice case, essentially. Further surgery was required as the result of a post-operative bowel complication. And the defendant was the doctor who the victim was referred to, who made the decision to operate at a later date. So he went into the hospital, he had knee surgery, a relatively foregone conclusion as to how the knee surgery was going to operate, but then, no pun intended, but then the further surgery was required because of a post-operative complication that began to take place. Now, the doctor, who was the person who the victim was referred to, made the decision to operate at a later date. And the problem here is that post this operation, the victim never regained consciousness and then ultimately died. Now, the question and the issue here was relating to the delay in the operation, the decision on the part of the doctor, who the victim was referred to decide to operate at a later time. Now, it was held by the courts here that the trial judge needs to give the jury sufficient direction in determining what gross negligence means. So, even though the jury have quite a significant amount of discretion in terms of determining a breach and then determining whether or not the breach of the duty of care, the negligence in question, rises to the level of gross negligence, that standard is something that, even though it is determined by the jury, it is something that needs to be directed by the judge. Making a determination caused the jury to be directed to look for a breach that is truly exceptionally bad, in quotation marks. The act or omission had to be, quote, such a departure from the standard that is consequently amounted to being criminal. Remember, when we talk about gross negligence manslaughter, the word gross in this particular phraseology is very important. We're not just talking about ordinary negligence which arises out of ordinary tort cases. This isn't a case of an individual who finds a decomposing snail in a bottle of beer. This is a case where we have individuals who die, and we have individuals who die as the result of significant departure from the ordinary duty of care, a significant breach of the ordinary duty of care that should be expected of individuals in these different positions. Such a significant breach that it amounts to criminal liability more than just ultimately negligent liability. Now, risk of death was something that was made clear when we talk about the case of Adamako, that the test ought to be whether or not there was a risk of death in making a determination as to whether or not you can make conclusions about gross negligence manslaughter. They say, and I quote, "The jury will have to consider whether the extent to which the defendant's conduct departed from the proper standard of care incumbent upon him involving, as it must have done, a risk of death." The risk of death element is quite important here, because ultimately manslaughter is a homicide offence. One of the things that is very important for a manslaughter charge to even stick is the fact that the victim has to die. It has to be a death of a victim situation. Finally then, let's talk about the case of Crown versus Rose from 2017. This is another case that goes all the way up to the Court of Appeal, and the defendant in this case was an optometrist who had performed a routine eye examination. Now, one of the things you should be amply familiar with already and should have in the back of your mind already is the fact that a lot of gross negligence manslaughter cases arise out of medical negligence cases. So in fact, one of the things that's going to be quite interesting is when we carry on doing our lessons on medical law in the future, we will be talking about gross negligence in that context, and probably will be referencing and citing these cases in more detail as well. But ultimately, the defendant in this case was an optometrist who had performed an eye examination, somebody who works at an optician's, okay? The result of this eye examination was that the patient, the victim, did not need glasses. Okay, so it was a relatively successful routine eye examination, and they found that there was no need for the victim to need glasses. Just under half a year later, the victim would die as the result of hydrocephalus. Okay, now this is something that is quite interesting, given the fact that the presence of hydrocephalus should have been seen by any competent optometrist. So one of the things that most people don't really recognize when you talk about going to the opticians is that you don't just go to the opticians for just the health of your eyes, and to determine whether or not you have glasses. A lot of people think that that is the case, but it's a bit more than that, because an optometrist, somebody who examines eyes, are actually able to see a further and a lot more than just the eye itself. They are able to see and potentially diagnose tumors and other kind of very, very serious and significant issues that an examination of the eye can essentially indicate. And the presence of hydrocephalus is one such example here. And any competent optometrist should have been able to see and identify the hydrocephalus, or identify signs of hydrocephalus, such that they would be able to maybe further refer them to a specialist in a hospital, and then for a full diagnosis to have taken place. Instead, the victim was told that they do not need glasses, that there was nothing wrong, and they would have ultimately died just under 6 months later from the hydrocephalus. In addition to this, they have a statutory duty. Optometrists will have a statutory duty to perform an examination for these kinds of conditions in the course of an eye test. So, like I said again, an eye test does not just involve the examination of the eye, it also involves statutorily the examination of other parts of the, or at least in the eye, evidence of anything that could be potentially very serious that would affect the eye in some way. So things like tumours behind the eye can actually be seen by optometrists. Don't tell me how, I'm not a doctor. The defendant had actually performed the correct procedures in this particular case. The optometrist performed all the statutory duties that they had to do for the examination of the eye test, but they had accidentally viewed previously established images instead. So rather than looking at the images of the patient who was actually in the room at the time, they looked on the images and they saw the images of a previous patient, of a previously viewed established images, or maybe even the same patient but previously to this particular examination. So ultimately, even though they followed all the statutory duties, they were negligent in their actions in essentially being able to identify any kind of very serious problem. Now, while the defendant was convicted at first instance, they were convicted at trial, this conviction was quashed at the Court of Appeal, since there was no serious and obvious risk of death when the duty was breached. And this is quite interesting here, because when the duty was breached, okay, this was during the eye examination, and there would have been no indication that the individual was going to have a serious and obvious risk of death at this particular point. In fact, it was only 6 months later, when the hydrocephalus would develop into a more serious condition, that the victim would die. And so what is interesting here is that the quashing by the Court of Appeal was under the basis that there was this lack of serious risk of death, a standard which was established or at least referenced in the original leading case of Adamako.